board member at the Law for Palestine organization. Hassan, thank you so much for your time. First of all, just give me your overriding thoughts, your general thoughts. This news broke about 3 hours ago.
This is definitely a historic step, something that has been expected of the ICC ever since 2015, if not before, since Palestine approached the International Criminal Court asking for a serious investigation in the occupied Palestinian territories, including war crimes, but not only limited to war crimes, also crimes against humanity, the settlements in the West Bank, the settler violence, so on and so forth. Finally, the ICC has acted upon a genocide that happened in Gaza. This step will definitely exert further pressure on the Israeli war cabinet, headed by Netanyahu himself, hopefully to change their policy, even though their track and record does not indicate that they would be positively affected by such a decision. But definitely the victims in Gaza, the victims all over the West Bank, all over Palestine, definitely would be happy to see that the murderers of their children would face some pressure, if not accountability. So the overall impression is that this is a step in the right direction. However, there are so many steps to be followed by this one. There are so many corrections as well to be added to the arrest warrants, because there are serious crimes that have not been included to the arrest warrants. As we have seen, genocide was not included, occupation was not mentioned, apartheid was not mentioned. Very serious crimes and very serious acts by the Israeli war cabinet that preceded October the 7th were not even mentioned in the press release let go of the arrest warrants themselves. So this is a step in the right direction, but it has to be followed by several steps to keep up with the gravity of the crimes being committed by the war cabinet.
Yeah, Hassan, you use the word pressure a lot, and we need to use that word to look at the pressure that might be coming from Israel externally, but specifically from Israel's allies. At the moment, we haven't really heard too much detail from, for example, Paris, London, Washington, Berlin. But what we do have is a statement from the British Prime Minister's spokesperson who says these arrest warrants from the ICC are not helpful and will not help achieve a pause in fighting. This is a man who leads a country that considers itself to be a beacon of democracy and decency. There is a criminal case that is about to start, which is what Karim Khan wants. And the British Prime Minister is saying this is not helpful. That can't be encouraging for Palestinians.
So when listening to such observations or comments from political bodies, I would remind myself and remind any of these bodies that we are not here talking about a political chit-chat. We're not talking about a political tea-talk. This is the International Criminal Court. These states have a legal duty towards the International Criminal Court. These states have signed and ratified the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute is not a political document. It's a legal document that has legal obligations and consequences to be followed once an arrest warrant has been issued. Binding to the United Kingdom, definitely binding to the rest of the members of the Assembly of State Parties of the ICC, which includes most of Western Europe, the United Kingdom, and many other countries. So now that the arrest warrants have been issued by the ICC, it has directly legally binding effect on these countries that have to respond to this arrest warrant by submitting, by handing over any of these leaders once they land on their own territory. If they refrain from handing over Netanyahu or Gallant or anyone hopefully soon to be acquitted, to face arrest warrants from the Israeli side quite soon, these states have a legal duty to hand over these individuals to the court. So regardless of how they feel about it, regardless of what politically they comment about it, they have a legal duty on this. And if they break it, it will be a precedent that would affect directly what they call the rules-based order that many of these countries have been speaking about. Now we're talking about the United Kingdom, we're talking about Germany, we're talking about France, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about other countries that have criticized the investigation at some point. But at this moment, if they take a step to break the authority of the court, including not handing over these individuals once they land in their territories, we will have a precedent for the first time in history where these states defy the court and work actively to undermine its work. Now we will be talking about a very different international legal order, if these courts are defied by the very same states that have been advocating them for some time.
Yes, and states do that. We know that there's an arrest warrant issued by the ICC for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he is still very comfortable in Moscow. What about the issue
he has not landed in any European country.
No,
so that
true. That's right. He was
weight.
recently in China, and Xi Jinping is not going to hand him over. We've also had Omar al-Bashir, the former Sudanese president, who's managed for a long, long time before he went to prison back home in Sudan, traveling around Africa. And those other African leaders didn't send him to the ICC. So that kind of precedent is there. But of course, you're right to highlight the obligations that nations have under the Rome Statute. Hassan, what about gathering evidence? How difficult will that be, considering that there are almost no independent observers allowed into Gaza?
Israel, this is a very important obstacle, to be honest, that because Israel is deliberately destroying evidence. If we noticed, the ICJ, in its provisional measures, reiterated the idea of preservation of evidence. And this did not come as a rhetorical request to Israel. The court seems to be quite aware that Israel is actively working on the destruction of evidence and obstruction of any attempts that lead to establishing evidence in Gaza. However, here we're talking about the gravest of crimes. I would say that evidence would be challenging if we were talking about lesser crimes, crimes with less gravity. Here we're talking about the crime of genocide. Even if the ICC did not call the spade a spade, in this case, it is very evident that we're talking about the destruction of a population or a substantial part of a population with the clear specific intent established by the war cabinet itself. We're talking about 30,000+ civilians killed in Gaza. We're talking about half of them, almost half of them, like 40% plus are children, are minors. We're talking about the total destruction of education facilities, hospital systems. 67 hospitals and medical facilities have been destroyed. We're talking about a very clearly documented crime. So regardless of the issue of accessibility to the evidence in Gaza, the evidence is there. And it's very close to impossible to hide. So it's a matter of time until these observers are allowed into Gaza. And it should be noted by these investigators that one side, which is clearly the Israeli side, is preventing them from reaching to the area where they can establish evidence. And in law, as in common sense, this is an indicator. Why would a state be afraid of establishing evidence if they are sure they have not violated the law? So this in itself is taken into consideration, and the gravity of the crime is an enough evidence to be preserved, if I can call it that way. This evidence is nowhere to go. Despite the Israeli deliberate policies to destroy evidence, this evidence will remain. It's a matter of time until anybody has access to them. And let's not forget that we live in 2024, and there are so many, the technological advancement allows us so many possible venues and mechanisms where we can collect evidence even when we don't have physical accessibility to one territory.
Hassan, I don't know if you know the mechanics of how the process will work, but if there were to be arrest warrants out there and the ICC were to actively pursue a criminal case like this, who would they want to talk to in terms of trying to understand who has given individual soldiers instructions to kill civilians? Would they want to speak to the soldiers and understand the chain of command and see how high it goes to be able to nab Netanyahu in Galant rather than a more junior military commander?
So the ICC works based on the principle of the gravity of the crime and the most responsible, even though the ICC calls it in different terminology. So when it comes to trying criminals, the ICC would automatically go to the top leaders. That's why we see the arrest warrants issued against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and hopefully soon Gantz, because there is no reason whatsoever for Gantz not to be included. He's a member of the war cabinet. He's very clearly genocidal in his statements, so there is no reason for him not to be included. But that's a side issue. When it comes to collecting evidence itself, they would need to, the investigation team of the ICC, which is established by the OTP, the Office of the Prosecutor of the Court, would be deployed into the territories where the investigation takes place. They would interview the victims. They would have their own access to the victims. We have submitted a number of testimonies, hundreds of testimonies. We have submitted some evidence, but we understand that the court itself, according to its own rules and procedures, would need to have direct access through its investigation team to the territories or to the individuals affected. So the court would interview the victims. would collect evidence, would make sure that the testimonies are matching, would make sure that the testimonies are geolocated, are quite accurate when it comes to the description of the crime, the characterization of the crime, as well as to the territory where the crime has happened, to make sure all the procedures are met of the court. But when it comes to interviewing soldiers or perpetrators, this is a tricky issue. It has not clearly happened in any other incident that the ICC would sit down with the soldiers, with the junior criminals, if I could call them so, to collect evidence from there. Usually, it would collect evidence from third parties and from the victims themselves. And again, in this case, we're talking about a very well-documented evidence. So I'm not sure there is a need to meet with the soldiers. And I doubt Israel would allow the court to meet its soldiers, because Israel is very aware that even some of these soldiers have documented some videos online of themselves destroying civilian properties. However, the court does not need to meet these junior soldiers in order to establish evidence. Meeting the victims, meeting the third parties, the international observers, the UNRWA staff, the UN staff, the staff of the international humanitarian organizations, the media personnel, so on and so forth, would be sufficient to establish well-balanced evidence on one particular case and on all the cases.
Just finally, Hassan, that explanation, by the way, is absolutely invaluable to understand your explanation of how the thread of the process would work. But in terms of guilt by association, if again we're at the stage where the arrest warrants are issued and the ICC pursues a criminal case, if there were to be examples of war crimes being committed, but being committed using foreign weaponry, would those foreign nations then be implicated legally?
So we have actually indicated this very clearly in our submission to the ICC, our communication based on Article 14, where we indicated that according to the Rome Statute, the guilt by association, or as you called it, or what we call it, complicity in crime, which has been established by a number of articles of the Rome Statute, and I would not busy you with the legal technicalities, but the ICC, the Rome Statute of the ICC clearly details the element of complicity in crime. And there are different degrees, there are different levels, there are different categories of this complicity, whether it is complicity in perpetration, complicity in planning, or complicity in providing the means to commit a certain crime. All of this is included, whether specifically and clearly in the text of the Rome Statute or in the practice of the ICC, or at least in the proceedings of the Rome Statute. So yes, complicity or guilt by association, if we could call it so, is definitely something that would be taken into account. However, not taking this into account would not be a legal issue, in my opinion, but rather a political decision.
Hassan Ben Imran, I cannot thank you enough for talking us through this breaking news and the arrest warrants being sought by the ICC for Israel's Prime Minister and Defense Minister. Thank you so much, Hassan.
Thank you.